Good evening. I am Mildred Olivier. I'm the Assistant Dean for the Office of Excellence in Diversity and Inclusion. And I want to thank everyone for coming to this symposium on race in medicine, genetic validity or racist legacy. But first, I'd like to just take a brief moment to really think about all those that we've lost with COVID and the injustices that we've seen in the media, as well as the giants that we've lost, Congressman John Lewis, Chadwell Bossman, John Thompson today. Just a moment of silence. Thank you. This is our first Health Disparities Symposium, especially Zoom in this status. It is a CME event. I'm going to ask Christina to go to the next slide. Today, this is a CME event and it's 2.0 credit hours, and you should only claim for the part that you're actually participating in. Next. We have the practice gaps, and you can read those, but really it's really to relate to genetic profiles of race, the multifactorial reasons of what happens in health disparities in clinical research and medicine. We want to look at the genetic, the institutional, the individual factors that really affect healthcare disparities in medical education. Our primary audience here today are you, our faculty here at Chicago Medical School, our students, our staff, and we are so lucky to have this wonderful presenter. They are an expert in their field and they're recognized as such, and they have a lot to tell us today. And we're able to go ahead and ask them questions as well. And one of those things is that we do have questions and answers area. And I want to encourage all of you who have questions and answers to go to that and not to the chat box. The chat box will be there for you to communicate within yourselves. The other option you can do is also raise your hand, and then you can verbally ask the questions to our experts. After each of the sections where they'll be speaking, you'll be able to ask questions. And finally, our next slide as well. Our learning objectives. We want to make sure that we want to summarize the current scientific understandings of the validity of genetics as it relates to race, the current and systemic institutional protocols that really affect why we can't access health care better, why we can't have increased quality of care in some of the situations that cause us to be different in our racial and cultural backgrounds. We want to identify these obstacles, and we want to understand what are the bias or unconscious biases and judgments that we make within seconds. And we're lucky enough to have one of our speakers as a patient who can explain to you what her own personal life was like as she entered into the healthcare system and what happens when we make assumptions about people right away. Next. And of course, these are our disclosures here for all the people who will be speaking today, as well as a wonderful, not only is it me in the academic learning environment, but I am lucky enough to have Dr. Carl Lawson, as well as Dr. Hector Rescato Flores, who will be speaking and moderating, and have invited some of our speakers here today. And most important, we were able to have this symposium because it was financially supported by SciPass, creating pathways and access for student success at Chicago Medical School. Next. So I will say, without any further ado, I want to introduce you, or at least yell up my fellow Dr. Hector Rescato Flores, please.
Thank you, Mildred. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Michael Yudell. We are very fortunate to have him. He's the professor and chair of the Department of Community Health and Prevention at the School of Public Health at Drexel University. He's the author of several books, including Race, Unmasked, Biology, and Race in the 20th Century. He edits the Columbia University Press series, Race, Inequality, and Health. And the title of his presentation is Abandoning Race as a Measure of Human Difference in Biomedical Research. Please, Dr. Yudell.
Hi, everybody. Just give me a second to share my screen. the new features of our new technological age as we live in these strange times.
As you're
Okay.
doing that, I will remind our audience that they will be muted between all the presentations, but once the presentation's over, they will be unmuted or they can unmute themselves. Thank you, Dr. Yudell.
Great. Can you see my screen? Are we in good shape now? Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks to the organizers who have invited me here today. It's great to be a part of this event. I would have loved to have been in Chicago, one of my favorite places. I was actually supposed to be in Chicago this week, but in these pandemic times, travel is a little different. So it's great to be with everybody virtually. So again, thank you for having me. As you heard from my introduction, this is an area that as a public health scientist, who focuses on ethics and history of public health, it's written extensively on issues of race as a measure of human diversity in genetic and social science contexts. It's really great to be a part of this panel. So I'm going to dive straight in because we've got about 20 minutes and we have a bunch of wonderful speakers who will follow me today, so I want to stay on time. So title of my talk is Abandoning Race as a Measure of Health Difference in Biomedical Research. There we go. So race is a lot of different things, right? First, it can be a source of pride, and this is a 1960s era civil rights pin, Black is Beautiful, you know, standing up against unfortunate centuries of racism and discrimination, which painted certain peoples as inferior or ugly, and this was a positive affirmation of Blackness. Race is also a source of self-understanding and community. And about a year and a half ago, I submitted my DNA samples to both Ancestry.com and to 23andMe to see what they had to say about my ancestry. Although I am largely Ashkenazi Jewish, which I probably did not need to submit my DNA samples to figure out, 23andMe suggested that I had West African ancestry, while Ancestry.com suggested I have Irish ancestry. Since I've made this slide a few months ago, these ancestry compositions have changed and sort of forces us to think about these services and about what self-understanding and race mean in a modern context. Race is also a source of resistance. This is Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, two heroes of the civil rights movement, and Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed, who helped to start the Black Lives Matters protest movement a few years back. Race is also a source of oppression and carnage. This is a lithograph of a slave ship, the hold of a slave ship, which brought millions of people forced from the African continent into slavery throughout the Americas and the world as well. This is an image from the early 20th century about eugenic sterilizations in the United States, the idea that different races had different traits and that certain traits could be bred out of our species, whether in a positive way by encouraging like to breed with like, or in a negative way by, as this slide shows, sterilizing them. There were at least 60,000 sterilizations in the country during the 20th century, many more of which are probably undocumented. This is the gates of Auschwitz, where many of my ancestors, many millions of my ancestors, well, not my personal ancestors, but my people perished in the Holocaust. And these are more recent racists at the University of Virginia a few years back, and the awful events that happened in Charlottesville. So race is a source of a lot of things. It is also a source of discrimination. These are barracks from Japanese internment camps during World War II, more modern internment camps of migrants coming from south of the border in the to the US. And of course, we know that discrimination persists. This is a paper from a few years back, which was a meta-analysis of field experiments showing that racial discrimination persists in hiring over time. This is a civil rights era, a pre-civil rights era image of Juan Crow in the South. We know a lot about Jim Crow, less about segregation between Latinos and whites across the South. And then finally, this is just from a week and a half ago, the United Nations did an internal survey of different races and used the term yellow instead of Asian and other terms to denote people from that part of the planet. They quickly removed it, and it's just another way in which racism continues to rear its ugly head. Race is all those things. It's a classificatory, but it's also a classificatory tool. And in our work, we think that in evolutionary biology, we think we can organize populations into different continental groups, but in public health work and in any federally funded NIH and other federal funding agencies funded research, we know that we are asked to report on race in the public health inclusion enrollment form, which is ubiquitous in scientific research today. It's mandated by the Office of Management and Budget out of the US Congress. And it was originally a tool to help ensure recruitment of diverse populations into research. Unfortunately, in many cases, it becomes not only a tool for recruitment, but a tool for data analysis. And what we have pointed to in our work is that this is very dangerous and that we need to rethink how race is being used in both bench, clinical, and other types of research. So with my colleagues, Dorothy Roberts from the University of Pennsylvania, Rob DeSalle from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and Sarah Tishkoff, also at University of Pennsylvania, we published a paper in 2016 arguing that race should be taken out of use in human genetics as a biological variable. We wrote, "We believe the use of biological concepts of race in human genetic research, so disputed and so mired in confusion, is problematic at best and harmful at worst. It's time for biologists to find a better way." And we have been, having this discussion for 4 years now, and I'll talk a little bit later on in the talk about the arc of that discussion, both over the course of the 20th century, because we are not the first to make this claim, and also it's happened more recently. So when do scientists and clinicians utilize race in their work? Well, evolutionary biologists use it to classify groups and study the history of human populations. Geneticists use race to investigate disease-causing genes within and between populations. Anthropologists use race to study human populations' physical and cultural traits. Physicians can use a patient's race to make decisions about risks for certain diseases and how they might metabolize drugs. And public health scientists use race to understand broader health trends within and between populations. But there are at the same time diverse opinions on the utility of this use in populations and at the bedside as well. So there are those who believe relevant genetic information can be seen at the racial level and that race is the best proxy we have for examining human genetic diversity. It is no longer possible to ignore average genetic differences among races. The geneticist David Reich from Harvard University told the New York Times in 2018. Esteban Burchard, who's a geneticist at UCSF, argued in epidemiological and clinical research, racial and ethnic categories are useful for generating and exploring hypotheses about environmental and genetic risk factors, as well as interactions between risk factors and important medical outcomes. There are others who argue that race is neither a relevant nor accurate way to understand or map human genetic diversity. The concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. The geneticist and genome scientist Craig Venter famously said at the White House in 2000 when the draft sequence of the human genome was revealed. And then finally, race-based predictions are in clinical settings because of the heterogeneous nature of racial groups and the relationship between them are of questionable use. Quote, "The scientific community must aim to elucidate the genetic and environmental factors that contribute to drug reactions and not be satisfied with a simple race-based approach." And that's an interesting paper also from Craig Venter's group, where he showed the sequence of his genome and the genome of DNA pioneer Jim Watson, and they have a longstanding series of disagreements between them, and part of the paper was Venter poking Watson. But in the paper, Venter showed that two self-identified white men had very different drug metabolizing genes, and one of them, Watson in this case, had a variant that appears more frequently on the Korean peninsula, and that if Watson had been identified as a white person, he could have been harmed by certain drugs based on that crude analysis. So what are some of the challenges of using race in science and medicine? One is there's a general lack of clarity and consistency in the use of racial terminology in research. You could see this in journals going from one article to the other, where racial categories are presented in different ways. Race is defined differently, sometimes as a real category, sometimes as a social construction. Sometimes there are 3 racial groups, sometimes there are 7 racial groups. It depends on what the authors are looking for. There is a general failure of scientists to distinguish between self-identified racial categories and assigned assumed racial categories, meaning some studies make claims about use data based on what the PI or the investigators choose people's races to be, and others will allow people to identify themselves. And finally, there remains a need to justify the use of racial categories relative to the research questions asked and the methods used. So lots of challenges. So what are some of the dangers? Well, we know from a recent study out of the University of Virginia medical system that there is racial bias in pain assessment and treatment recommendations that are rooted in historical beliefs about biological differences between Black and white people and their pain tolerance. This is a racist idea that dates back to justifications for slavery and for enslaving Africans and Black Americans. And from the conclusion, the present work sheds light on a heretofore unexplored source of racial bias in pain assessment and treatment recommendations within a relevant population. These were medical students and residents in the context where racial disparities are well documented, pain management. And it demonstrates that beliefs about biological differences between Blacks and whites, beliefs dating back to slavery, are associated with the perception that Black people feel less pain than do white people, and with inadequate treatment recommendations for Black patients' pain. We've also seen this in sort of broader popular claims about race and race difference. Nicholas Wade, who published this book, A Troublesome Inheritance, in 2014, made incredibly racist claims in the book about Africa and Jewish people and all sorts of crazy racist and anti-Semitic things. And it forced geneticists, evolutionary biologists, and other clinicians to go back, because their work was used in this book to justify Wade's racist viewpoints, to make a statement in the New York Times saying that their work was misused, even though their work clearly used racial categories to suggest that there were differences in outcomes between populations, even though if those differences weren't meant to be the hierarchical differences that Wade thought that they were. And finally, there are really important critiques of the health disparities discourse. And this is actually from The Onion, which is a parody newspaper, a satirical newspaper. And it kind of cuts to the point of why some of the language and the way we talk about health disparities can be so problematic. A new study finds Blacks more likely. A Harvard University study of more than 2,500 middle-income African-American families found that when compared to other ethnic groups in the same income bracket, Blacks were up to 23% more likely. Our data would seem to discredit the notion that Black Americans are less likely, and so on. So the point here is, as I read it, is that there's this simplistic, reductionist way in which we sometimes do health disparities research, where race becomes the primary way in which to analyze differences between groups. And that speaks to, a failure of social science methods to be integrated into public health and natural scientific research. And I think that that's a challenge for us going ahead that we could talk about later in the Q&A. So if race is such a controversial concept in biology and medicine, then why do scientists and clinicians keep on using it? Well, there's a long history of this. This is a lithograph from the skull collection of Samuel Morton. He was a racist physician here in Philadelphia, where I live, who collected skulls and made claims based on the cranial capacity that intelligence was different between racial groups, which was of course false, and of course is false. But he made these claims and sort of laid the groundwork for a century and a half of thinking, of very unfortunate thinking in this area. This is an image from a eugenic congress in 1921 at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where white and Black chromosomes were made to actually look different in this slide. And what is amazing to me is that while a lot of this was going on, there was always resistance to this. And I want to talk briefly about two people who really framed a lot of the difference over the dissent around these issues over the course of the 20th century. One is the civil rights leader and great social scientist W.E.B. Du Bois, and the other is the evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who I just want to talk about for just a minute. Du Bois, of course, helped develop many of the social science methodologies, a lot of the mixed methodologies that we in public health and other fields continue to use today. And he came here to Philadelphia actually in 1896, in August of 1896, 124 years ago, having just completed his PhD at Harvard, the first African-American to do so. And he signed on to do what was the first study of a Black population living in a city with these novel technologies that he had helped develop. And there were two reasons for the study, depending on who you spoke to. Some wanted to justify racism in Philadelphia, but Du Bois, in his radical act of research, wanted to undermine those ideas. And what was so amazing in his book, The Philadelphia Negro, which was published just a few years later, he argued against what in the 20th century would become the hardening of ideas of racial difference across the 20th century and reducing them to biological and very soon genetic differences. So Du Bois had a place in sort of offering up the first vibrant critique from a social scientific viewpoint, using methods that he helped hone of scientific racism. And he pointed to what we now call social determinants of health as, underlying what people believed were hereditary or biological differences. Theodosius Dobzhansky, about 35, 40 years later, as one of the most important scientists of the 20th century, would argue against simple typological notions of race, meaning that there were types that were specific to each group, and you could look at a person's skin color and make assumptions on what they were in the world, which of course is a racist notion. And Dobzhansky tried to push those ideas out of scientific practice. Unfortunately, he held on to the idea of race as an organizing tool because, as he saw it, it was a methodological tool. It was a way to organize peoples and populations that had no pre-existing, in his mind anyway, pre-existing notions of hierarchy. But as his career evolved and racists started to utilize his ideas to make claims about difference, he would then have to fight them with, the biology that he believed in. And over the course of his 50-year career, would back off from ideas about race as an organizing tool between peoples and populations. And in the early 1960s, would call upon the field to find a better way to study human genetic diversity and to remove race from the equation. But we still live with sort of these two Dobzhanskys, which is, on the one hand, as he started out, the belief in the utility of the biological race concept in the study of human genetic diversity, and as he evolved into later in his career, the belief that the biological race concept is imprecise and of limited use, and we needed to find better ways to study human populations. So that's really where we are today, in this odd paradox that we live in. And you hear it when papers start out by saying, we understand that race is a social construct, but we're going to use it anyway. This is the best way we have to study groups. We need to understand racism. But what I and some of my colleagues are arguing is that we need to find a way to neutralize the biological beliefs in race difference, but also find ways to study the impact of the lived experience of race, and that being racism. So we can circle back to that a bit later. I know I'm coming up on time. I think I have about 3 minutes, so I'm going to use it to cover my last slides, and I'm just going to skip ahead a bit. So what's the current landscape? Well, for one thing, it's too expensive currently to sequence everybody's genome, so medicine still relies on race as a proxy to make best guesses about an individual's disease risk and how one's genes influence that response positively or negatively to drug treatments. And because genetic variants can cluster in populations, the belief is that this can help clinicians and drug companies make medical decisions about one's race. There are potential dangers in this. We inadvertently reinforce a crude understanding of race, forgetting that it is a highly flawed concept that cannot be used as a proxy for an individual's own genome. and that we privilege biological over social and economic determinants in understanding human health and well-being, which is a problem that we see across clinical and scientific research. What are some fixes? IRBs and journals require authors to define what they mean by race and population. And this is, of course, both an issue of language and of utility and precision. What are some alternatives? As I said, scientific journals, IRBs, and professional societies should encourage the use of terms like population or ancestry in place of race. We believe in our work that ancestry is a process-based concept, which is a statement about an individual's relationship to other individuals in their genealogical history, while race is a pattern-based concept that has led scientists and laypersons alike to draw conclusions about hierarchical organization of humans, which connects to an individual to a larger, preconceived, geographically circumscribed, or socially constructed group. And phasing out racial terminology in the biological sciences would send an important message to clinicians, scientists, and the public alike, especially in this political moment, that historical racial categories that are infused with notions of superiority and inferiority, even if not in a current intention, have no place in scientific study. Like I said a moment ago, using race as a political or social category to study racism and its biological effects, although fraught with challenges, remains necessary. And we need to think about how to do that in ways that doesn't foster beliefs in racial hierarchy. I mentioned that Dobzhansky was looking ahead in the early 1960s, and we need to take up his challenge. So what have we been doing? Well, following the publication of our paper in 2016 and a few other folks working in this area, the NIH had a workshop focusing on this issue, calling to require more precise and consistent terminology in the study of human populations, encouraging NIH to require social determinants data be collected beyond the required racial and ethnic data on the inclusion enrollment form. And that would bring together social and natural scientists to really rethink how we study human populations. Thinking about how to examine electronic medical records to help researchers better identify social determinants in genetic research. There was another meeting a few years later at the academies that we've been working with since 2016 to try to get them to launch one of their working groups to look more deeply into this. And we are still awaiting, I know the academies is awaiting funding from either private or NIH sources to do this. And we have a letter coming out in Science on September 11th calling upon the NIH to actually fund this effort. And if any of you are interested in this letter, we are looking for community signatories. So if you're interested, please send me an email later, and I'm happy to send you the letter if you're interested in seeing what we've done. The Academies Committee would be, as all Academies committees are, a committee of 12 to 14 experts to examine over 18 months these issues and issue back to the fields of human genetics, evolutionary biology, and so on, some consensus statement on how to do this better, how to move past race as a reductionist and biological concept in studying human populations. I'll close. Just 2 weeks ago, a congressperson from Texas called upon the National Academies to also scrutinize racism in science. So this is an issue that is not going away, especially in today's world. And I will close with that and just say thank you so much for giving me the time to talk about this today.
Thank you, Dr. Yudell. Such a wonderful presentation. Christina, do you see questions from the audience?
Not yet. We don't have questions from the audience in the Q&A.
Okay, so let me jump in while those questions appear to ask Dr. Yudell. Why do you think melanin has been playing such an important role historically? Is that we are so primitive to group together, look alike? Is there a fear of differences? What do you think could be historically a reason?
So I think what I hear you saying is that, you know, the way in which humans historically have perceived one another based on skin color is somehow inscribed into who we are as a species. And that's sort of, you know, racism is natural. I tend to be more optimistic than that. I think, you know, I think that, you know, racism is is a trait that is taught. And if the rise of racism over the last few years is any indication, people can shift ground pretty quickly based on history and, sort of contemporary thinking about themselves and about different groups. And I think it is an unfortunate feature, especially of American history, that racism is so deeply ingrained from the founding of our nation that it is really hard to shake that notion in all areas of society, whether it be science and clinical practices we're here to talk about tonight, or whether it be, other, social things. So.
We have a question from Patrick Thornton.
Yes, so,
Patrick, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to speak if you want to ask your question.
Thank you. So maybe I misunderstood something, but it sounded like you were suggesting that the term ancestry might be a more suitable term than race to cover some of the same constructs that that we sometimes value in medicine and healthcare, but it seems to me that just kind of sidesteps the problem, and that it also privileges individual and biological factors over social determinants of health.
So thanks for the question. I think it's an important question, and I think, well, I don't think that's not what I'm arguing. I'll start with that, and I'll say that we recommend ancestry as a term in our paper, although we are open to thinking about other terminologies and categories for which to study human populations, and that's part of why we're recommending this National Academies panel to help us think through these issues rather than prescribe an answer. But from a personal viewpoint, I think, as one of my earlier slides showed, abandoning race for ancestry does a few things. One, it takes a term out of practice in the context of biology that is so imbued with racism and hierarchy that is an important thing in itself. There was in my book, I talk about a famous anthropologist writing to Dubjansky, who I spoke about a little earlier, who argued in the 1940s to abandon race as a category because as he called it, race is a trigger word. You utter race in any context, and he was referring to a scientific context, and it means something different to everybody, and it is so deeply imbued with history. Our argument is that ancestry is a process-based concept. It's about thinking in terms of the sum of our parts, our entire genomes, rather than these discrete boxes that race, no matter how hard we might try, force us into. But we also don't want to privilege biological factors over social and other health determinant factors. And that's a big part of our effort. If you take a look at our 2016 piece in Science, we talk about that issue. And in the letter that you'll see in the September 11th issue of Science, we make that argument as well. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yudell, and we're going to go on, but I will encourage you to maybe try to answer some of the questions that are there for the people that are asking more questions.
Yep.
So
thank you.
This is wonderful because some of the things you talked about are perhaps some of the issues that Jocelyn Willis McClelland sort of experienced herself. She was born on the south side of Chicago. She and her husband have been married for 36 years, and they have 3 beautiful children, and they currently live on the East Woodland area, where they are now both retired. And Jocelyn will tell you her experience as a patient. Jocelyn?
Hi, thank you, Mildred. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Jocelyn Willis McClelland. I'm honored to be able to share my story with you. I apologize in advance before I even start. I had chemotherapy on Friday, and it's starting to kick in right now. So let me see if I can just get my screen right here. So my story starts in 2007, 2008. I was having persistent symptoms of heart problems. I was in Naperville, and I went to Naperville Community Hospital. There I was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy, which is the thickening of my heart wall. that was causing pain and shortness of breath. When I asked why my wall was thickening, I was told probably because you have high blood pressure. I emphasized then that I did not have and never had high blood pressure. I was very proud of my 110/60 blood pressure. As I would complain of Rice Krispie sounding crackles in my lungs when I laid down at night, and especially if I also had swollen ankles and water retentions, and say, something's wrong with my heart, my doctor would say, Jazzy, your heart is strong. We've run echocardiogram tests and the ejection fraction was always healthy. So they test my lungs, they checked for and diagnosed me with sleep apnea. Still, my heart wall was growing thicker and thicker. I was confident that I knew what heart strain felt like. I was a moderate athlete. I ran, I swam, I skied, I hiked. My husband and I had ridden our bikes more than 2,000 miles over 2.5 years we were living in Europe. At one point, while complaining of chest pains radiating up into my jaw, my nurse practitioner suggested that I see a dentist. Even after placing 3 stents in my heart, I was still complaining of pain and being overlooked. Finally, with God's prompting and the Spirit's help, I decided to use the same skills that I had developed while obtaining my MBA in finance and to do my own research. After researching, I wrote my cardiologist a 7-page paper replete with diagrams explaining why I believed I was suffering from congestive heart failure, not from a weakening of my systolic function, because as he noted, my heart was still very strong, but from diastolic dysfunction caused by the thickening of my heart wall and its inability to expand far enough to circulate the fluid in my lungs, or what I've now come to know as congestive heart failure with a preserved ejection fraction. Upon diagnosing myself in the fall of 2009, again with the Spirit's prompting, I began to search for some doctors that were smarter than me to help me to figure out what was at the bottom of all this. As I gathered my records and had them transferred along with my 7-page self-diagnosis to Northwestern, a great deal of chart lore or chart fiction came along with the records, including a diagnosis of high blood pressure. Thankfully, this time my doctors listened to me. When my doctor suspected my particular heart disease, he suggested that he had medications that could not only treat my heart problems, but also treat my high blood pressure. When I insisted that I did not now and had never had high blood pressure, he walked away and looked at the old ECGs that I had also transferred. He came back and said, "You're right. You do not have high blood pressure. You have never had high blood pressure. Because if you had, your ECGs would have had these high peaks and deep valleys. Instead, yours had been flat the entire time." As a result, he knew there was something else going on. He realized he'd have to dig to determine why my heart wall was thickening, back to the very first question I'd asked in Naperville. Upon performing a heart biopsy, it was determined that I had cardiac amyloidosis, a deadly disease with a 2 to 3 year shelf life. And had I not advocated on my own behalf, I would undoubtedly have been long dead by now. So here's some of the key takeaways from my story. Number 1, do not fill in the blanks in your understanding. Find out the missing answers. Number 2, do not make cultural assumptions. Being Black does not necessarily mean that you have high blood pressure. Number 3, listen to and believe your patients. Since being at Northwestern, I'm so grateful for the care I've received. I love that my docs talk to each other about me. I love that they make me feel like I matter. I love that I get mailed a copy of my follow-up visit notes along with my other outside doctors with my name listed as a referring physician. I love that I feel like my input is valued and like I'm an active participant in my own care and treatment. Thank you so much for providing me with the opportunity to share my story with you.
Thank you so much for that testimonial. I hope that people will listen to some of your recommendations. And now I invite Dr. Carl Lawson to come on and introduce our next speaker. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to now introduce to you Dr. Edwin K. McDonald IV. who is a board-certified physician who works with patients with small bowel diseases, obesity, and other conditions affecting their digestive system. He is dedicated to improving the health of individuals and communities through nutrition education, and his interest in the effects of nutrition on health and disease stem from his experience with Project Brotherhood, an innovative clinic dedicated to providing accessible, affordable care for Black men on Chicago's South Side. Dr. McDonald is an active researcher whose work has been funded by the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, which is part of the National Institutes for Health. Dr. McDonald earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and his MD from the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. It is my pleasure to welcome this evening and introduce to you the Chicago-born, Chicago-raised Dr. Edwin McDonald, gastroenterologist at the University of Chicago Medicine. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Carl. I appreciate your introduction. Can everybody hear me right now? So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this conversation right now. So we're going to be discussing a topic. It's called "Why Are You Eating Hot Dogs Every Day?" Navigating food deserts, food swamps, racial and health disparities here in Chicago. All right. So in terms of disclosure, I'm on the medical advisory board for AbbVie and Salix. I won't discuss any off-label interventions. So I'm a trained chef. I went to culinary school after finishing my residency and while I was doing my nutrition fellowship in the University of Chicago. And most people ask me, why in the world would you actually go to culinary school as a physician? This makes no sense. And for me, I worked in restaurants, but what really inspired me was one of the first patients that I took care of when I was an intern at Northwestern working at the VA hospital. And I want to use his story to have a conversation about the impact of processed foods, to talk about food swamps and food deserts, and also discuss health disparities and some interventions. So my patient, he was a 59-year-old veteran. He was recently divorced. He was underemployed. He couldn't cook. His wife left him primarily because he had a lot of different health issues and comorbidities. One of them included erectile dysfunction, but everything stemmed from his diabetes, his high blood pressure. He also had fatty liver disease. He was slightly overweight, and he had a mild stroke in the past. So when I saw him as a young intern, I was the first person to really ask him what I think is one of the most powerful questions that any physician can ask any patient: what do you eat? I looked over his chart. He never saw a dietitian, and all the physicians who took care of him before me, all they did was just increase his blood pressure medications every time his blood pressure was elevated, or add more insulin whenever his blood sugar was elevated. But no one really asked him what exactly was he consuming. So I asked that question, and his response to me was just hot dogs. And I probed a little bit deeper. I said, well, what are you doing for breakfast? What are you doing for lunch? What are you doing for dinner? And over and over and over again, he just said hot dogs. So on the inside, I felt like this picture. I mean, I was in awe that for every meal, every day, for years, he was just eating hot dogs. Now I'm professional, so I didn't really demonstrate that face to him, but I realized that he really just gave me a glimpse into his world, and I had to understand why he was eating hot dogs every single day. Like, what were the underlying reasons that prompted him to do this in order for me to really help him as a physician? So he told me he couldn't cook. He likes hot dogs. He also mentioned that he didn't have any money. And he also mentioned that there were no grocery stores in his neighborhood. So I, recently having graduated from medical school at that time, I felt I was prepared to be a physician, but my medical education did not prepare me to address eating hot dogs, not being able to cook, not having grocery stores in your neighborhood. So I had to figure out, how do you navigate some of these issues as a physician? And I spent the next decade or so trying to figure out that question. I'm still figuring out that question as an attending. So for him, he was really mostly eating processed foods. His diet consisted nothing but processed foods. And I had no lectures in medical school about processed foods. So his reasons for eating processed foods, specifically the hot dogs, included he couldn't cook, he actually liked hot dogs, and they were cheap and easy. So he's not alone in having those reasons. So there was a good market research study that looked at the reasons why Americans were eating processed foods. They found that 43% said they were affordable, 41% said they were easy, 20% said they taste good, and 61% said they were convenient. Now, what's interesting about this study, for the average American, based upon a study that used data from Haynes, for the average American, 60% of our calories come from ultra-processed foods. Now, what are ultra-processed foods? We'll get into that a little bit later, but it's also important to point out that this is a stark contrast than what's seen in other countries. So in France, their consumption of ultra-processed foods is way less. In one large study, it was only 36%. So the average American is eating a little bit different than the average Frenchman. So what are the types of ultra-processed foods, or the types of food processing? So there's NOVA classification, and the NOVA classification identifies 4 categories of food processing. You have your unprocessed foods and minimally processed foods. You have your processed culinary ingredients, which include salt, sugar, your processed foods, which are like canned foods and dried fruits. And then you have your ultra-processed foods, which are typically the snacks and everything that we see at the gas stations and the checkout aisles of the supermarkets. So these are foods that basically use industrial ingredients that, you know, you can't really make on your own. Like, for instance, I'm a trained chef. I have no idea how to make a Twinkie. Like, I don't have ingredients in my kitchen to make a Twinkie. I don't have yellow number 5. I don't have all the different preservatives and emulsifiers that are involved in that process. Again, this is just examples of ultra-processed foods. So why should we care about food processing? Well, it's important based upon a lot of different studies. So there was one recent study published in Cell Metabolism where they gave people 2 weeks of ultra-processed foods and 2 weeks of unprocessed foods. And they essentially looked at their weight and other measurements, including hormones that affect satiety during each of the 2 week parts of the study. What they found was, after matching for calories, energy density, macronutrients, sugar, and fiber, they found that during the 2 weeks of eating ultra-processed foods, the average participant ate actually 508 calories more than they did when they were doing the unprocessed foods, and they actually gained almost 2 pounds during that process. So we also know, based upon large population studies, that ultra-processed foods are actually linked or associated with increased mortality. So there was one study that demonstrated that eating greater than 4 servings of processed foods daily was associated with, independently, a 62% increase in mortality for all causes. That's particularly relevant in the United States, where there are about 650,000 deaths per year due to diet-related diseases. And most of these deaths are due to non-communicable diseases. So my patient, he had many of these non-communicable diseases. He had diabetes, he had high blood pressure, he had fatty liver disease, and again, obesity, and he had a stroke. Now, obviously in the United States, there are disparities in these conditions, which is one of the reasons why we're here having this conversation that we're having. There are higher rates oftentimes in African Americans. So obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke also are all higher in African American men specifically. So this begs the question, are disparities in diets a cause, especially since we're talking about, things outside of genetics? So it's interesting. The same study that looked at the percentage of calories that the average American is consuming from ultra-processed food also looked at the demographics of the cohort of people within that study. And they found that there was really no significant difference between the amount of calories coming from ultra-processed foods in non-Hispanic Black participants and also non-Hispanic white participants. So both were around 60%. The only significant differences were really amongst people who were closer to immigration. So the Hispanic population and also the Asian population, which in this study they lumped as other. But the subgroup analysis found that if people had family members, if they were immigrants themselves or their first and second degree family members were immigrants, they had a lower likelihood of consuming more calories from ultra-processed foods. Now, in Chicago, the Department of Public Health did their own study where they looked at how frequently people are consuming sugar-sweetened beverages for at least a month. And based upon these statistics, they found that within the Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black population, more or less these numbers were similar, but the percentages were higher, much higher than the Asian Pacific Islander population and also non-Hispanic whites. So for non-Hispanic Blacks in Chicago, according to this study, 36.3% were consuming at least one sugary beverage per day for at least a month. Where only 13% in the Asian population and 15% in the white population. What about fruits and veggies? So in general, the average American, we need to do way better with our fruit and vegetable consumption. So according to another study using NHANES data, only about 9.3% of Americans meet guidelines for vegetable intake. So that's basically consuming about 2.5 cups of vegetables per day, which is not a whole lot. They also looked at differences in terms of race and ethnicity. And what they found was there was really no significant difference by race and ethnicity in terms of fruit and vegetable consumption. Now, however, in Chicago, they found that things seemed to be a little bit different. Whereas the Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black population were consuming a little bit less vegetables than the non-Hispanic white population. So it's interesting. I mean, like, why do these differences exist in Chicago and also other urban cities, but they're not necessarily reflected in NHANES data? And part of his story, my patient's story, maybe even highlight some of these social determinants that not only affect healthcare disparities, but they even affect the food that we consume. He mentioned that he had no money, which to me translated to food insecurity. When you look at Chicago, especially when we look at Chicago historically, Chicago really is a tale of two cities, especially if you focus on the Black and white populations in Chicago. So there was a good study that looked at how Chicago has changed over time from 1960 to more or less the present. And what they found was in 1960, 69% of African Americans lived in communities that were predominantly Black. In 2011, 63% lived in communities that were predominantly Black. So not much change in that span of time. The median income for an African American in 1960 was $4,800, and compared to $7,700 for a white family. In 2017, the numbers didn't really change all that much. At least the disparity did not change all that much. So 21,000 for African Americans and 58,000 for white households. Poverty rate, very similar. So in 1960, 7.4% of white people in Chicago actually were below the poverty line, whereas 29.7% were for African Americans in 1960. And in 2017, the number is 30% for African Americans and 10.3% for non-Hispanic white citizens of Chicago. Unemployment rate, it was drastically different in the 1960s. So in 1968, the unemployment rate for African Americans was 7.6%, whereas it was 2.3% for non-Hispanic whites. Fast forward to 2018, it's 18.7% for African Americans and 3.4% for non-Hispanic whites. So looking at these numbers, you could see how that could affect a lot of the social determinants that we're talking about. So another reason why I like to talk about food insecurity, it's associated with higher rates of processed food consumptions. So in Chicago, we have higher rates of food insecurity amongst Black and Latino populations. So it's not surprising that you see more processed food consumption, specifically with sugary beverages, and less consumption of some of the healthy natural foods such as fruits and vegetables. Now, what's also interesting about food insecurity, or about how income affects eating behavior, there was a good study that identified that poor people actually pay more for groceries because at convenience stores, the prices are typically higher. In fact, the study revealed that the prices for food at convenience stores are about 25 to 50% higher. Now, in general, about 1 in 7 Americans are food insecure. Half are white, and rates are 2 times higher in Black and Hispanic households. In Chicago, overall, about 11.2% Chicagoans are food insecure. And again, the majority of those are Black and Latino. And these are post-COVID projections. So for my patient, he also mentioned that there were no grocery stores in his community. which indicated that he was probably living in a food desert. And again, at that time, as a medical student, I didn't have any education about food deserts, let alone how do you address eating behaviors that can come from living in a food desert. So my patient, was living in the Englewood community on the south side. And Englewood, it's a South Side community not too far from the University of Chicago where I work, where the average income is $19,000 per year. It's predominantly African American. And Englewood specifically, about 35 to 57% of the residents of Englewood suffer from food insecurity. And similar to my previous side, Englewood is another example of the tale of two cities that we often experience in Chicago. So if you look specifically at the rates of diabetes-related deaths, in Englewood, per 100,000 people, 101 people die from diabetes. Whereas Lakeview, just 8 miles north, only about 35.8 people die per 100,000 people from diabetes. Now, Englewood is also a food desert. It is similar to many of the other neighborhoods that are food deserts in Chicago, and the fact that Chicago's food deserts are almost exclusively African American. Now, the term food desert is an interesting one. It actually originated in Scotland in the 1990s. It did not originate in the United States. And in Scotland, they used it to describe why certain tenements had poor health outcomes. And what they found was in these tenements, also similar to the projects that we use, the term projects that we use here in the United States, those tenements basically did not have any grocery stores or healthy food. Now, the USDA, they have a definition for food deserts that's a little bit different. So the USDA defines food deserts as at least 100 households more than a half mile from the nearest supermarket and no access to a vehicle. And then they also included rural communities. So these rural communities would be communities that contain at least 500 people, or 33% of the population, that live more than 20 miles from a nearest grocery store. So with food deserts, again, Chicago is not alone in that the food deserts in Chicago are a majority in African-American neighborhoods. Nationwide, predominantly Black neighborhoods have 52% as many supermarkets compared to white neighborhoods. And the type of neighborhood stores have implications. So there was a good study that looked at how the type of supermarket you have in your neighborhood can affect atherosclerotic disease, but also being overweight and having obesity. And what they found was that communities that had supermarkets oftentimes had a lower prevalence of obesity and being overweight. Now, it's interesting, in Chicago, they look specifically at the prevalence of obesity amongst children in different communities. So Steve Whitman, one of the great researchers here in Chicago who passed away not too long ago, did this study. And what he demonstrated that Norwood Park, which is a neighborhood on the north side, it has pretty much the least amount of Black people of all the neighborhoods in Chicago. The rates of childhood obesity in Norwood Park were only 19%, whereas in Humboldt Park, North Lawndale, Roseland, South Lawndale, and Westtown, the rates were much higher, almost 3 times higher. And pretty much all these communities are either majority Black or majority Black and Latino. So the question is, how do we address some of these issues? Should we solely focus on just increasing grocery stores? Well, it's complicated. The solution lies not only in having more grocery stores. And Mari Gallagher, who did probably one of the landmark studies of food deserts in Chicago, came up with this concept of the food balance score, which is the relative distance of grocery stores and fast foods. So what she found was neighborhoods that had a food balance score that was out of balance, where there were more fast food places compared to supermarkets that had healthy foods. A neighborhood that had a high score or a high food balance score, what she found was those neighborhoods actually had higher rates of potential life years lost from cancer and also cardiovascular disease. And again, these were majority Black neighborhoods. And Englewood in of itself, as such, is also a food swamp, which is probably a more appropriate term than food desert, because there's a lot of food in a lot of these communities. It may not be healthy food. So the definition of a food swamp is basically an area in which a large relative amount of energy dense foods inundate the healthy food options. So similar to Englewood, nationwide, majority of the food swamps actually occur in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So there was a good study that looked at food deserts in New Orleans, and what they found was that in predominantly Black neighborhoods, there was about 2.4 restaurants per square mile, whereas in predominantly white neighborhoods, there was only 1.5 restaurants per square mile. So what about cooking? He told me he could not cook. And this is actually one of the reasons why I became a chef. So I actually started giving him some recipes, and that inspired me to go to culinary school. But he was not alone in that there were other men, especially of his generation, who weren't cooking. So there was a good study that was done that looked at the increase or the change of men who were cooks from 1965 to 1966 on up to 2007 to 2008. And what the study revealed that in 1965, only about 29% of men were cooking. But in 2008, that increased to 42%. And men also spent more time in the kitchen. So women over that same time period actually decreased in cooking. So from 1965 to 2008, women in 1965, about 92% of women were cooking, whereas in 2008, 65% cooked. Now, obviously, a lot has changed in that time period, and this represents a lot of progress to some degree as far as having access to higher education and having access to more jobs. But, cooking is still a fundamental way to control your health. So I ended up giving him recipes. I hooked him up with the Greater Food Depository. I also had him go on the 61st Street Farmers Market, which took SNAP funds. And he actually lost a lot of weight, and I was able to get him off of a lot of the medications that he was on. But his story really highlights a couple major themes that also can affect health outcomes as far as disparities. So again, there's availability, there's access, there's knowledge and behavior. And oftentimes we have to address those as opposed to solely focusing on genetics. So I will stop here because I don't want to go over time.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDonald. I see in the Q&A, we have a question for you. Are you ready to do Q&A?
Yes, I am.
Lovely. So the first question comes from Justin Vladecki, and he says, my wife wrote her dissertation on food utilization in Honduras and realized that poor nutrition literacy was a key contributor to poor food utilization. Many of the people in her study considered themselves to have a diverse diet because they prepared their tortillas, beans, and eggs differently for 3 meals a day. In your opinion, how much does poor nutrition literacy contribute to poor diet in the United States? If so, how can we work to improve nutrition literacy?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And I think in general, as Americans, we definitely are exposed to complicated nutritional information. So if you go on Instagram, not even go on Instagram, if you turn on the TV, a lot of information that we get comes from marketing. It comes from sources that are really focusing on economic gain as opposed to educating the population around health and healthy eating. So that's one big issue. And even within the public school system, focusing on nutrition and health education and food education is really just not a part of the average education that we receive as Americans. Within certain communities that have been disadvantaged for years, that those effects are probably exacerbated. So specifically within the African American community, I mean, there's clear studies that demonstrated that a lot of unhealthy food, has been marketed specifically to the African American community in a disproportionate fashion. So all of this can combine to affect our health literacy when it comes to nutrition, which is one of the reasons why I actually teach culinary medicine and actually do a lot of education. So at the University of Chicago, I actually do a lot of cooking classes. So this is me in Englewood, where I have a cooking class where I'm teaching some of the junior high school kids how to cook. And I'm one of the chefs who teaches our culinary medicine class at the University of Chicago. And outreach is important. So I, try to educate wherever I can. If that means opportunities to go on television and talk about food, or again, within the University of Chicago, I do monthly cooking demonstrations for all patients, primarily because we have to raise our level of health literacy, I believe. And then I also have a website where I try to talk about food and really distill some of the information that I learned from some of our medical journals and put it in a way that's easy to package, easy to understand for the average person. And then I also work with other chefs. So not only should we educate our lay population, but we should educate the people that are actually preparing our food. So Rick Bayless, he has a culinary school for underserved students, I believe 18 to 24 on the west side of Chicago. And I'm the person who does the nutrition curriculum for them. And these are all chefs that work in restaurants that many of us probably have come to know and love.
Dr. McDonald, thank you so much for taking the time this evening to address us. You made it very clear that the reasons that poor health outcomes, that whether it is obesity or if it is high blood pressure and the other diseases that you mentioned and disparities that you mentioned are unequally distributed. The reason that they're unequally distributed is because poverty and food insecurity are unequally distributed as well within a city such as Chicago, which is highly segregated both racially and then also in terms of personal income as well. As I mentioned to you in prior communications, our students, they go to Stroger, they go to Sinai as clinical sites, and so what you provided us today, what you provided them today, will serve them well in interacting with patients who reside within those food deserts and those food swamps that you articulated so clearly. Thank you so much for your assistance and for educating us this evening. And I wanted to now move on to our next speaker. We truly do have some wonderful individuals here, and it is a great pleasure for me, great honor for me to introduce to you Dr. Michelle Morse this evening. She is an associate physician in the Division of Global Health Equity, a hospitalist in the Department of General Internal Medicine, and assistant program director for the Internal Medicine Residency Program, all at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Morse is also an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School and an affiliate of the school's Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. She is also a co-founder of Equal Health, an organization that aims to support the development of Haiti's next generation of healthcare leaders and support health system strengthening. Dr. Morse earned her MD from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and her MPH, her Master's of Public Health, from the Harvard School of Public Health. Thank you so much, Dr. Morse, for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for the generous invitation to join this incredibly distinguished panel. I've learned a tremendous amount myself, despite spending much of my time on these issues. So really appreciate the perspective also of the patient who shared her story so generously with this community. I'm gonna speak a little bit about approaches for addressing institutional racism and recognizing some of the limitations of addressing institutional racism. And it's really an honor to get to do this in a way that hopefully is gonna integrate the experience here in the US, but also really take a global perspective. Much of my work, as Dr. Lawson mentioned, is really grounded in global health as well. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how social movements, particularly the movement for Black Lives Matter over the past several years since 2013 in particular, created a real window of opportunity at my home institution at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and also speak a little bit about how that window of opportunity can and cannot be used for change, and also look at some of the challenges and again, kind of the glass ceiling and trying to make institutional change in the context of a system of healthcare that is really about a healthcare industry and the medical industrial complex. So why is this an important moment for institutional change? I don't need to be here to tell you that exactly, but I do want to share just some basic starting points and grounding definitions. I do think language is really important, and I really appreciated Dr. McDonald's presentation as well, and his use of language when it comes to questions of structural change and health equity. I'm going to use the term health disparities as differences in health outcomes, whereas I'm going to use health inequities as differences that are avoidable, unjust, and rooted in history, with health equity being the opportunity for everyone to achieve their full potential. The definition of racism that I'm going to use is Dr. Kamara Jones's definition of racism, which is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, that doesn't have any grounding in biology or genetics. And then, as I just mentioned, kind of that the definition of race that I'll be using is quite consistent with the really powerful presentation from Dr. Yudell, race being a politically constructed way of grouping people, again, that has no genetic or biological basis. I do think that these concentric circles have been a helpful framework for me, especially in my reflections over many years, going from being an undergraduate student all the way through residency, thinking about what the forces are that really drive health and health outcomes, and recognizing that biological forces or even just healthcare forces are a small part in this larger context of social and societal forces that are far more powerful in driving health. I think that this graph helped me to also make that connection and recognize is using what is called this index of health and social problems, which is a combination of various health and social metrics, as you see on the kind of right side here of the screen. So if you look at the US, again, in rich global North democracies, the US is clearly an outlier with both the highest levels of income inequality as well as the highest levels of health and social problems on this index. Not a surprise to any of you, and certainly not to anyone who is taking a walk around any neighborhood in the US. But I think we fail to often make the connection between inequity in the US, social and economic inequity in the US, and the global connection. And I always try my best to make the point that we can be very, very myopic in the US and fall into American exceptionalism very easily if we don't recognize the role that the US empire has played in global economic oppression of the global South, neoliberalism, including things like structural adjustment programs that robbed global South countries of funds to invest in health and other social programs, as well as our global system of racial capitalism, which the US is perhaps the most explicit utilizer of. And that creates maps like this one, which shows, again, kind of the legacy of colonialism for sure, but also the legacy of the power of the American empire. And Donald Trump, as our current president, is really only the recent, only the most recent person to continue this trend of global imperial domination. But bring that lens back to the US and just look at our country and look at the phases of racism that our country has been through, recognizing that only the most recent 13% of American history are in the era of what we call structural racism, from the civil rights movement until now. The large majority of our history, we were in an era where chattel slavery of enslaving Africans was accepted, and there was a corollary in the health system for what that meant. There was a corollary in how physicians saw Black people who were enslaved that went along with the widespread societal acceptance of Black inferiority and hence rationalization of enslavement of Black people. Similarly, through Jim Crow era, another version of how the health system accepted and supported a racial hierarchy that put Black people and many other indigenous and people of color at the bottom of the hierarchy. And then it was already mentioned by Dr. Yudell, the study in 2016 from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science showing persistent racist and inaccurate beliefs of trained medical trainees on the differences between Black and white people. So we have a long way to go, and it's only recently that we came to see the error in our ways around structural racism. And again, another foundational paper by Dr. Zinzi Bailey and colleagues looking at structural racism and the social arrangement in the US. And the legacy of that persists across wealth, poverty, unemployment, infant mortality. You see all of the categories here showing, again, a structure where white people are on top and everybody else is at the bottom, truly a system of white supremacy with significant health impacts. When you take that to Boston, where I lived part of the time for the past 10 years, and you look at racial redlining, which is in a map here from 1938 in Boston at the bottom right-hand side. And then you look at rates of chronic disease hospitalization just, to this day, to the past decade. There is a pattern that is predictable, but also not immutable. This is not an immutable pattern. This is a human-created pattern that is addressable. We've chosen not to address it. So bring in critical race theory, which hopefully helps all of us to understand and question objectivity, and also question how and try to understand how racism is so thoroughly embedded in our society. And Derek Bell, amongst many other legal scholars, were the founders of critical race theory in the 1980s. They describe several of the key tenets, and you've heard of many of them: intersectionality. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw really helped to develop, founded, and really helped to explain, as well as other tenets like the social construction of race, which has already been described. The fact that racism serves the material and psychic interests of the dominant group, which in our case here in the US is white people, and interest convergence, which perhaps we'll have a chance to talk to, but speak more to, but really describes the fact that when significant structural change happens in the US, it really only happens not because of a moral awakening of whites, but because it is in the interest of whites, who are the dominant racial group in our racial hierarchy in the US. It's in their interest to make that specific change. So Brown versus the Board of Education actually served the interests of elite whites in multiple ways, including wanting to look moral to the rest of the world in the post-World War II era, after fascism was quote unquote stamped out, and looking at also an interest amongst elite whites in actually changing economic domination in the South of the US, and wanting actually to make the South more opened up to the capitalism of the northern part of the country, amongst other reasons. Similarly, if you apply critical race theory to public health and medicine, as Dr. Chandra Ford and her colleagues have done through developing public health critical race praxis, then you start to think, well, gosh, is science objective? Is medicine objective? All of the things that we're taught about the objectivity of medicine should be questioned. And the difference between critical race theory and public health is that critical race theory posits that science is actually not objective, and that you need to generate knowledge outside of the core knowledge base of public health to actually advance anti-racism and racial justice, because the core knowledge base was developed in the context of structural racism and needs to be completely rethought. So what are some of the successes and challenges in trying to do the work of institutional change in healthcare with a racial justice lens? I use the term anti-racism because it seems to be a term that everybody wants to understand, but long before Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's book, of course, many other people were speaking about anti-racism. So let's just briefly talk about a very powerful example of how a biological definition of race persists in how we practice medicine. And I know many of you have probably heard a little bit about some of the efforts to look at this, the use of a race corrector in the calculation of kidney function in EGFR. And if you remember the 1999 MDRD study, which is the one at the top, and also think about the CKD-EPI study in 2009, both of these regression analyses and formulas use a correction factor for Black race. 1999 feels like a long time ago, but it's very recent in terms of the history of medicine and the adoption of that calculation and across laboratories in the US. But if you look more closely at the MDRD study, the foundational initial study, well, a very small number of Black patients were included in it. Ethnicity was assigned by study personnel rather than a self-determination or a self-disclosure of race by the study participants. And the explanation for the difference in signal that was noted, the difference in measured GFR that was noted for patients categorized as Black in the study, the explanation that was given in the MDRD study was a greater muscle mass amongst Black patients in the study, but this was based on a few very small studies with very questionable scientific grounds. So what's the bottom line on this? Well, using Black race as a proxy for muscle mass is inaccurate, unscientific, poorly founded, and frankly racist. And the impact of using a race corrector for EGFR means that kidney function for patients who are Black and for whom the corrector is added in calculation of their EGFR, those patients are systematically made to look like their kidney function is better than white patients with the same measured GFR rate. Now, what does that mean? Well, the impact is unfortunately in the same direction as the racial inequities we see in kidney disease outcomes and mortality for Black patients, unfortunately. So end-stage renal disease is 400% higher amongst Blacks. Referrals for kidney transplant happen later for Black patients, and transplant outcomes for Black patients are unfortunately worse. And so it's hard to imagine that this race corrector, even though some people believe that it makes the calculation of kidney function more accurate, it's hard to imagine that it doesn't make racial inequities in kidney disease worse. So students like yourselves who have far less to lose than academic faculty members who've built their careers on this work have started to demand that race correction end. And this has happened at several institutions that are very well respected, the first of which is Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital. Several other institutions have followed, including UCSF, University of Washington, my home institution, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Mass General. And most recently, Vanderbilt University Medical Center also eliminated it. And this is an opportunity to just mention my organization, Equal Health's campaign against racism, which is global, and we're now in the third year of it, and have been rolling it out in partnership and with the mentorship of Dr. Kamara Jones. Our national chapter of the campaign, we have 23 chapters across 10 countries. And the national chapter worked for 2 years to really push for Vanderbilt to make this change, and they just won after 2 years, and this was announced just last month in July. So I'm going to skip forward. I know I'm running short on time. The other example I want to share of the potential for institutional change is a body of work that I supported as co-chair of the Department of Medicine Health Equity Committee at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where we looked at examples of institutional racism within our walls to really mobilize community of faculty, trainees, and staff to address structural racism at our institution. And what we looked at was the observational data from trainees at our hospital was that there just seemed to be more Black and brown patients on the general medicine service and more white patients on the cardiology service. And so we looked at heart failure because it's one of the most common admission diagnoses at our hospital. We have a cardiology center of excellence that's pretty well known. And we also noted that for patients on cardiology, they were more likely to have clinic follow-up. The patients on cardiology actually had lower readmission rates, both at 7 days and 30 days. And a big part of that is because cardiologists are better at taking care of heart failure than general internal medicine hospitalists like myself. But it also was a part of the wraparound services that are available on the cardiology service, where patients are able to get services like home weight monitoring and further support from nurse practitioners as well to monitor their heart failure. So we looked at almost 10 years of data for patients self-referred to the emergency department who were admitted again to our general medicine service, which is where I work, or to our cardiology service, and we looked by race. So we were trying to measure racism, not biological differences between white, Black, and Latinx patients. And we looked at over 1,900 admissions over the course of those 10 years. And what we found, perhaps not surprisingly to any of you, is that Black and Latinx patients were systematically less likely to be admitted to cardiology. They were much more likely to be admitted to the general medicine service with heart failure symptoms, again, self-referred to the emergency department, all other things being essentially equal. And this was not about insurance status, which was not one of the considerations in admission triage. So what we saw, of course, that there was a compounding cycle of inequities where the heart failure patients that were more likely to be admitted to general medicine actually had higher readmission rates. There were no racial differences in readmission rates for patients with heart failure on the cardiology service. And patients who were admitted on the cardiology service were more likely to be admitted to cardiology on the next time that they were admitted for heart failure. So this compounding difference was a huge problem. This again, we worked hard to get our faculty members to agree that this is an example of structural racism. You can imagine the concern about raising our hands and publishing data saying, hey, we have examples of institutional racism here, but we were able to push for that and do it. And we were also able to push for 3 projects to really further understand this inequity and really start to address it, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if that's helpful. So how far can we go? As I mentioned from the beginning, in a system of racial capitalism, in a system of imperialism and neoliberalism, how much institutional change can we really expect at healthcare institutions that, again, are fundamentally a part of the medical industrial complex? Well, I think your generation's going to help us answer that question. We did write a little bit about the change process and how movements like the Black Lives Matter movement really helped us to create a window of vulnerability for deeper and more serious and honest conversations about institutional racism at our institution, but also recognized in this description that social movements doctors and nurses are at institutions like Brigham are not a part of social movements formally in many ways, and much of our training actually makes it very difficult for us to be agents in social movements, even though we certainly could be. And part of that is because our training makes us look for short-term, rapid turnaround outcomes. We are told that we are experts, so we have an expert identity. We're also told that we have quite a bit, we're also told that we ourselves should be leading this kind of work, and many of those things set us up to not be the best participants in social movements. But that doesn't have to always be the case. It really depends on how we see ourselves and how we build power, either with communities or separately from them when we have insular conversations just within our ivory towers. I think miseducation of health workers and health professionals is a huge challenge. And one solution to that is a framework called structural competency that really is about training health workers to actually recognize the way bigger forces shape symptoms, diseases, and outcomes. There's lots more to say about that, but until we are able to systematically ensure that that miseducation about the biomedical model as the only model is changed, we're going to have lots of challenges with really addressing institutional racism. And until we use payment policy and healthcare policy much more effectively to address health inequities overall, but especially racial health inequities, we're stuck. And we often forget, actually, this is Juneteenth this summer, this tweet really caught my eye about how we used Medicare policy to desegregate hospitals after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we haven't used Medicare policy to address racial justice as effectively since then. And this has been shown by several of the other panelists, so I won't dwell on it, but it's just to say that the difference between Blacks and whites when it comes to everything from unemployment to life expectancy to household income to home ownership, yeah, it's improved since the 1960s, but the gap has not really narrowed. And that means that we really need to be thinking about restitution. I would encourage all of you to take a look at this preprint that just came out recently, looking at what it would look like to eliminate the racial wealth gap by doing reparation, by enacting economic reparations for descendants of enslaved people in the US, and looking at what that would do to address COVID transmission. It's certainly a timely analysis, but this could be done for many other diseases besides the burning platform at the moment with COVID. So with that, I will close and say thank you to many of my co-conspirators, co-organizers, mentors, and collaborators, and look forward to any questions that you all might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morse, for that, incredible presentation. This ties directly into a number of conversations that we have been having throughout our university, and then specifically within Chicago Medical School. We have a question here from Dr. Lise Elliott. In the cardiac study, did you also happen to look at gender disparity? Because I've seen that women are referred less than men for advanced cardiac care. Does this mean women of color have the poorest outcomes for heart disease?
Great question, and thank you for bringing in intersectionality. I think applying intersectionality to statistical analysis is a topic for another day, but our primary outcome was looking at Black and Latinx patients, but we did find that women were also less likely to be systematically less likely to be admitted to the cardiology service as opposed to the general medicine service. So we did find that, even though it wasn't our primary outcome, and we described it in the discussion, as well as how we have tried to address these institutional inequities as an area for serious action and an area that really also, as you describe in your question, should not be forgotten or brushed under the rug. But we didn't find that Black women had the worst outcomes in our study. We didn't really look at heart failure outcomes we really looked at triage of patients from the emergency department to general medicine or cardiology. So I'm sorry, I don't have the answer for Black women's heart failure outcomes at this time. But thank you for that question.
And thank you, Dr. Morse. It was nice to see you again after we had met in Haiti, of course. I will move on to our next and final speaker, and that is Deborah Willis Fillinger. Yes, of course, it was her sister, Jocelyn, who gave her testimonial. And Dr. Fillinger is alum of Chicago Medical School, class of 1979, and she's an internist. She trained at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and she is now the director of Office of Minority Health and Health Equity with the Health Resources and Services Administration, as we know as HRSA. And her primary goal is really to look at cultural competency as program resources, high quality care and services for about 25 million isolated, medically vulnerable or uninsured people in America. And I want to welcome her today as she talks about racism in healthcare.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really am honored to be here among an amazing panel this evening. And I do want to correct the record. I'm actually retired. I'm no longer there at HRSA. There was a 30-year career there. I'm class of 79. So you know it's about that time here to shift gears and support from a different route. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I really appreciate what was shared today. I think that we are all pretty much on the same page in different ways. And I have to say that my focus today has been really very elementary by comparison in some ways to what else has gone on here. Because as I was thinking about the audience, I was thinking of students who are still fresh, not quite sure how to navigate, for example, the social determinants of health that were mentioned by Dr. McDonald, or not quite sure how to deal with or even identify perhaps implicit bias or structural racism in their institutions. So please forgive me if this is too elementary, but my focus here has been, I guess I can give you a quick history as far as my experience has been. Yes, I graduated in '79 and spent time at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and then worked in a number of different communities through the National Health Service Corps for a while and in private practice. Got completely bored, partly because of these social determinants of health that I saw being so much more important in some ways than even direct patient care. And you know, all of us here in the panel, I'm sure, and the rest of the audience are familiar with the social determinants of health really representing 80% of what we see in terms of health outcomes by comparison to those things that happen in the hallowed halls of our clinic, where we can really maybe affect a 20% change in health outcomes, if that. So really this concept of really being attentive to social determinants at the same time as we're dealing with other, the patient as they've presented is really very important. So what I really wanted to do today was talk a little bit about the I guess seminal studies that helped us start looking at the unequal treatment, the Institute of Medicine in 2003. And please let me know, for those in the audience, if you are already familiar with not only the fact that these studies exist, but what they really mean. And I have to say that over the years, as I've talked to my colleagues and as I've learned myself, there's some subtleties in terms of how healthcare works in the healthcare system and why these different studies and the follow-up studies that have occurred have taken so long to take root. And we'll talk a little bit about the racism and the history of the United States a bit to help explain that. But certainly there was a concern, and we had these disparities for so long, and it was right at the turn of the century, Congress asked the Institute of Medicine to take a look at the situation and help understand the disparities. And of course, when that was done, they found that across virtually every disease process, that every medical procedure, even the most simple to the most complex, that minorities did receive, in fact, poor quality care and less intensive care. And so in looking at that, trying to understand more where that how that transpired, looked deeper and understood also that there were actually not just social determinants in play, meaning those issues related to access or socioeconomics or financing, but also that there were disparities in the way that care was provided. So, you know, as was so eloquently described just now, that we within the healthcare system are complicit in actually creating the disparities in different ways. And we have different roles. I mean, there are those of us who are in positions of administration and are able to sometimes affect change within the administration, of structural changes in flow and policies and procedures that are being developed. But then once again, we're all so busy in our lanes that it's very difficult sometimes to step back and even see what is going on and to measure it properly and to know exactly where to go from there. But racial and ethnic disparities definitely were identified in 2003. And then, you know, it's sometimes easier to think that these problems are really coming from the outside, that they're not, that we aren't responsible for them. And it's very difficult to get beyond the indifference. But when we really start to look at where these disparities are coming from, it's really important to stop and look back at our history. And that was just, we've been talking about that together as a group here. But seriously, 300 years of slavery and Reconstruction, Jim Crow, well, slavery and Jim Crow, really, it does have long-term impact on the way that generational wealth has accrued in this country. Things like your property, your home, your car, your ability to go to college, your ability to access a grocery store versus being in a food desert, really has been built into the structure of our government for many, many years in different ways. And in the 1960s, of course, the civil rights laws ended some of the more obvious ways that government was complicit in creating these racial, I guess, discrimination is very simple. But for example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Social Security Act of 1935, for example, and the fact that people of color, farmers and domestic workers in particular, were completely written out of that law. We're not able to access the Social Security benefits. So for about 2 generations between 1935 and the 1960s, people of color did not have access to Social Security. So you can imagine what that means in terms of, once again, generational wealth and even the ability to take care of one's family and their parents and then their children. So you're talking about a definite disparity there. The GI Bill, the same thing. It was very well designed to eliminate people of color who had been involved in World War II, came home, participated in supporting their country, but then were not able to get access to the GI Bill. And I don't have the statistics directly, but I believe it would be like one African American to every 3,000 white Americans actually were able to get access to that GI Bill. And the numbers were obviously that affects education, which is once again impacts generational wealth. And then of course, redlining was also mentioned here earlier, and housing discrimination clearly has multiple levels of impact, just in terms of crowding or the lack of options in terms of where one wants to live, but in addition, once again, financially, by not having the opportunity to have accrue value in your home and then use that value, leverage it for transportation or for education, is really significant. So when we're looking at the situation as it exists right now in America, so many of my non-Black friends, people who are not of color, or who are even immigrants who are new to the country, have some privilege and even getting here, can't understand the situation that they see in America with African Americans and Latinos who have been in this country and have experienced some of this structural racism. To be able to understand that, I think, is important when you and once you've done that, your ability to walk in someone else's shoes and listen and consider the individual differently may arise. But the next thing, just in terms of this trajectory that we're seeing now, and I've heard Black Lives Matter being mentioned just now, this concept of the war on drugs and the new Jim Crow that some of you are hearing about. It's really important to understand what the war on drugs did and does to communities of color, and how that continues to affect the economic stability, the generational wealth again, and just the family structure and the community structure is really important. And I just wanted to read some of the quotes from Michelle Alexander that describe the impact of that. And actually it was Michelle Alexander and a number of others, but let's see, I'm gonna go through, actually I'm gonna do that in a few seconds because I have it on another slide. But so this is just a background slide to help us understand that America is steeped heavily in racism. And so when we see disparities in the access to healthcare and in communities and in the workplace, understanding that there is something behind this that's been very well constructed to create the results that we have. And so we'll have to start becoming more curious and more open-minded as we look and listen. Now, one of the problems with bias and implicit bias, and I'm going to go to that next, all of us do have we discriminate, we have prejudices, we have stereotypes that we've developed. We have some of them negative, some of them positive. Certainly they're subjective. There's conscious bias where we know what we're thinking about, we know what we feel, we know what our inclinations are. And that's one kind of way of sorting and of determining our preferences. It's very natural, it's very normal. And I think it's important to know that we all have them. And if we start there, it's easier to have a conversation, to be honest, to be open, to have a conversation about what we're feeling. So I wanted to say that because I think one of the solutions that we'll have going forward as we try to navigate the future and create solutions together without, as African Americans, as Latinos, and our allies, that it's going to be important to understand that prejudices and stereotypes are natural, they exist. And the other thing is in healthcare, because we're dealing with such large amounts of data and information at any given time, the way that brain naturally functions is to sort and categorize and put things into neat boxes as much as possible. And so we've gotten into negative habits really within healthcare of trying to quickly get to the answer when you're under pressure, when time is limited, when resources are limited. So the emergency rooms, the front line, so to speak, where quick decisions are being made about what to do and how to triage an individual, send them to primary care or to internal medicine floor, or send them to the cardiac care unit. Oftentimes, the implicit biases that we have will jump in when these are things that are not conscious in our sorting process, in our determining processes, and we'll act on them without being aware of them. So it's important to understand what implicit bias is, and also then to get in touch with what yours looks like. So unconscious and unthinking discrimination is the simple term, definition for implicit bias. They involve associations outside of our conscious awareness. We're not even aware of them. They lack reason, they lack truth, and oftentimes there's no awareness that we've even gone through this process in our minds. It's very blurry, we're confused, we don't even remember making that decision. It was done so quickly. All right, I see I've got 5 minutes. So implicit biases are a concern certainly in healthcare because we want to be careful not to disadvantage those who are already vulnerable. So it's important to, one, know what your own biases are, and then try to be conscious, be present, be thoughtful about walking in another's shoes, asking questions. In the case of my sister, by the way, she did all of that research herself. I was at a conference. I didn't have anything to do with it. I got a copy of her email and I sat down and screamed. I couldn't believe that she'd done that. But it's important not to assume that the person you're talking to doesn't know what they're saying, doesn't know what pain is, doesn't know whether they've had high blood pressure or not, et cetera. That we are smarter than the patient is the first mistake. And so being able to be conscious of that and to be humble and to be aware that you do have biases are very important. So there have been lots of reviews 2003 on. I mean, the unequal treatment spawned lots of research. And so there are lots of systemic reviews now and summary reviews of how to assess your implicit, your bias, your implicit association tests are pretty easily available online for lots of different topics, and it's important to get in touch with your own. But of course, the lots of reviews show that, in fact, people tend to have, the majority of people in healthcare have a pro-white or light-skinned, anti-Black, Hispanic or American Indian, or any sort of a bias against darker complexions. And other studies have also showed that the bias resulted in poor provider interactions and poor quality of care, as was previously shared. So it's important to quickly, again, I'm just going to get back to structural racism. So you've got implicit bias, this bias that we carry from all of the experiences, of our lived experiences, that we need to actively reprogram. And so there are different techniques now that people are using to try to, once they recognize their bias, to actually try to slowly open their eyes and revise their views and slowly release themselves from their automatic responses. But I guess I don't have a lot of time, but just to give you an idea, I think we did talk a little bit about housing, employment, education. You can understand how that impacts our actual, our experience as well as those of our patients. The American criminal justice system, the Black Lives Matter movement, is an incredible opening to begin to right the amazing injustices that we see in this country. The numbers are, everyone who has, if you haven't read the new Jim Crow, please do if you want to know what's going on out there and that's causing this tinderbox that we're all sitting on right now. It's important to understand that the structural racism and the long-term abuse of men and women in this country. But so being curious, looking for structural racism is really important. And these are some simple things to consider as you're looking at your own environment. Think about things like the facility, the location, hours of operation, resource allocation. Where are the staff? Where are the supplies? Are there language and cultural material, staffing, facility, art? I was in a health center once that had pictures of all the pictures were of one type of, when they were actually Native American. It was a Native American clinic, and the two pictures they had of Black people were in the syphilis section of the clinic, and it was in a community that was shifting, and the organization was having some difficulties making the shift, and they were clearly marking their territory, but at the same time creating an awful environment for a very large percentage of their patients. But these things sometimes can be not noticed if you don't notice your art or the decorations or the materials, the staffing within your environment, and how that could impact the populations that you're working with those actually can be considered offensive, not offensive. That would be more of a neglect, which is an important piece of what implicit bias does, but as well structural racism. Well, I'm going to go ahead and quit stop mine. I think I've run out of time, but I think what I wanted to get to was that it's important to just be in touch with our biases. Lots more research needs to be done where there's an overlap between not only some more coding for research that really incorporates the minority patient perspectives with the research and looking at outcomes and IAT sort of at the same time. And I listed a few resources here. There's so much out there that's just Google implicit bias. It's a lot of fun. And make sure that you get your own Harvard EDU implicit bias. Do your own test so that you can see where you fall. All righty, let me see if I have any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Willis. We have a question I'm going to go to right away from Amy Swift Johnson. And she asks, how do we teach faculty about their own biases and their teaching styles?
So teaching styles in particular, I'm not familiar with, but I would suggest that within the Harvard EDU implicit on the website, there are a number of different types of, there's probably about 20 or 30 categories to measure yourself by. So I think I would start there because it's eye-opening, first of all, because these, once again, these are blind spots. These are, I call it lizard, sometimes we're in a lizard brain cycle where it doesn't even go to consciousness, it just goes straight to the amygdala and out. And so there are, so I would suggest going to that site. I can look for more. I can do follow-up, but that's what I would say at this point.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you and I want to thank everybody. This was really an excellent session. We had all these experts. I mean, we probably could have done an hour or two on just each of these specific areas because they were just so amazing. And this is, of course, just the beginning of many conversations to come. As we close, I want to thank again our champions, our Dean Chatterjee, our academic learning environment chief, which I called, which is Dr. Newton Vadia, and the people who have really put together for the CME efforts. And most important, the person behind this screen, the scenes, as I should say, Christina Randa. She's just done an amazing job at helping us put this together. I want to remind everybody that this is a CME event, and I think Christina's going to put in the chat how people can go ahead and get their CME. And without the team, our CMS diversity team, Dr. Carl Lawson, Dr. Hector Moscato Flores, thank you so much for identify some of these experts and having them come through. And again, I want to thank all of you for taking the time tonight to be on with us. We have about just a few 3 minutes or so. Is there any closing or other statements or people would like to make, please?
Do I have time for a question?
One question, go ahead.
Okay, so a number of faculty have expressed an interest in incorporating lessons on structural racism in medicine within their lectures. If any of the panelists had any guidance that may help the faculty members.
This is Michelle, and I'll just say really briefly, checking out the structural competency framework, I think will take your coursework and kind of teaching of trainees to the next level. I think it gives a really powerful framework for how to get beyond biological or even behavioral definitions of understandings of inequity, and give some really powerful suggestions on how to teach differently, understanding and integrating structural forces from policy to funding allocation. So I would strongly recommend structural competency.
Great.
Thank
And Jocelyn, I see that you're here. There was somebody who's asked whether or not Clyde Yancey was your doctor, and do you think that ancestry has helped him to be more understanding of your problem?
Yes, he actually was my doctor when I was hospitalized last year. He's the head of cardiology there at Northwestern, correct? I believe. And yes, he did a fantastic job taking care of me last year. And
that helped in him understanding more about your problem and listening to that?
yes, I think it's so funny, my little document has circulated. And so I have a reputation at Northwestern in part for that little introduction I made of myself to the organization. So yes, I think it has helped.
Great. Well, once again, I want to thank everybody again. This is just the beginning of many conversations to come, and we'll see you next time. Thank you again for all of our guest experts, and till next time.